Delia Hargrove spent 22 years giving everything she had to a company that gave her a cardboard box 2 weeks before Christmas. She drove 4 hours up the Maine coast with the heat barely working and a phone that had stopped ringing, heading toward the one place she had stayed away from for 11 years, her late father Wallace's cannery on the edge of Grover's Neck. She expected a dark building, a locked door, the smell of salt and abandonment. What she found when she turned off the county road and saw the property for the first time in over a decade stopped her cold. The lights were on, and what she discovered inside those walls over the weeks that followed proved that Wallace Hargrove had understood something about his daughter and about that land that a certain man in a press suit had spent years and considerable effort trying to make sure she never learned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Tuesday morning, which was the kind of detail Delia would remember later with the particular sharpness of moments that reorganize everything before and after them. Sutton Briggs's assistant had called at 8:43, not Sutton himself, which told her something before she even reached his office on the 14th floor. In 22 years, she had received every significant piece of news from Sutton directly. A phone call from his assistant at 8:43 on a Tuesday in December was a thing that meant something. She took the elevator up. She had worked on the 9th floor for 11 of her 22 years in the acquisitions division, and the 14th floor had always felt like a different atmosphere, cooler, quieter, the kind of carpet that absorbed sound in a way that made conversations feel muffled and provisional. She walked to his office, and his assistant, a young man named Greg who had been there 14 months, looked at her with the careful blankness of someone trying not to show that he already knew. Sutton was standing when she came in. He didn't sit until she did, which was a courtesy she registered and set aside. The office had a view of the water, gray that morning, with low cloud sitting on the horizon. She had always liked that view. It occurred to her, sitting in the chair across from his desk, that she was probably seeing it for the last time. He was organized about it. She gave him that. The language was careful and the framing was considered. Words like restructuring and position elimination and difficult decision. The standard vocabulary of a conversation that has been rehearsed at least twice, possibly with HR present at an earlier draft. He said her contributions had been valued. He said the timing was unfortunate. He said the severance package was generous, which was true. She would discover later, in a specific way, that things are true when the person saying them needs them to be true and has the power to make them so. She listened. That was what she did. She had always been a good listener, had understood early in her career that the person who listens well in a room like this one comes away with more information than the person who talks, and she was interested, even now, in the information. What she noticed was what he didn't say. He didn't mention the Allgate account, which she had flagged 3 months earlier as structurally problematic, in writing, in a memo she had sent to 2 people above her and 1 person below. He didn't mention the conversations she'd had with the compliance office in October. He didn't mention the fact that of the 4 people in her division, she was the only one whose work touched the Allgate file. She noticed all of this with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to register what is absent from a room. She carried the box to the elevator. She walked through the lobby. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Phil who had worked the morning shift for at least 14 years and who had always asked after Celia by name, looked at the box and looked at her face and said simply, "Take care of yourself, Delia." She said she would. The parking garage was cold. She put the box in the back seat and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Outside the concrete walls of the garage, she could hear the city doing what the city always did, indifferent to the specific weight of any one person's Tuesday morning. Her phone had 2 missed calls from her colleague Barb, who would have heard already. She didn't call back. She sat and thought about where she was going to go. Her apartment lease in Portland was up the 15th of January. She had known this for months, had been planning to renew it, had not yet signed the renewal paperwork because something had made her hesitate, some instinct she hadn't examined closely enough. She thought about Celia in Seattle. She thought about the short list of friends she could call who wouldn't try to fix it with the first words out of their mouths. She thought about December, the particular cruelty of December, The way it compressed everything that was already difficult and added lights and music to the background of it. And then she thought about Grover's neck. Wallace had died 4 years ago, leaving the cannery to Delia in a will that was simple and direct, the way Wallace himself had been simple and direct about most things. She had handled the estate paperwork from a distance, had paid the property taxes each year through automatic transfer, had accepted Lorna Peck's offer to keep an eye on the place in exchange for a small monthly arrangement. She had not been back. There had always been a reason not to go, and she had accepted those reasons without examining whether they were reasons or something else's. She started the car. She pulled out of the garage into the gray December morning. She drove north. She turned off the county road onto the gravel track that led to the property at 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. The track was in better condition than she expected. The gravel was relatively fresh. She noticed this and filed it without yet understanding what it meant. The cannery came into view around the last bend in the track. It was a long, low building, wood and corrugated metal, sitting above a working cove on a bluff that her grandfather had chosen in 1941 for reasons that had more to do with the tide patterns and the depth of the water than with the view, though the view was considerable. Wallace had run the operation for 30 years before his knees, and the economics of small-scale commercial fishing had made it impossible to continue. The building had been closed for 9 years before he died, and closed for 4 more since. Delia stopped the car at the top of the track and looked at it. The lights inside the cannery were on. Not a single light, not a security lamp on a timer. The working lights, the long fluorescent strips along the main floor ceiling, were lit, visible through the high windows along the east wall, casting the particular industrial glow that she had grown up watching from her bedroom window across the cove. She sat with the engine running and looked at the lit windows for a long moment. Then she drove the rest of the way down. Delia got out of the car and stood in the cold for a moment, listening. The cove below was quiet except for the water moving against the pilings and the particular creak of the old dock shifting in the current. There were no other vehicles on the property. No footprints in the thin frost on the gravel that she could see from where she stood. Just the building and the lights and the sound of the water. She went to the side door rather than the main loading entrance, the same door she had always used as a child, the one with the iron latch that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly before pressing the thumb plate. 11 years away, and her hand knew the motion without being told. The latch gave. The door swung inward. The smell came first. Not the smell she had been bracing for, the closed-up smell of a building that had been abandoned, damp wood and stale air and time. It was something closer to the smell she remembered from childhood mornings when Wallace was already an hour into his day before she came down to the dock. Coffee and machine oil and cold salt air and the particular dry warmth of the overhead heaters running against the Maine winter. The heaters were running. She stood in the doorway and looked down the length of the main floor. The workbenches along the west wall were clean. Not recently scrubbed, but maintained, the kind of clean that comes from regular attention over a long period rather than a single effort. The processing equipment, old and long and used, had been covered with canvas tarps that looked newer than everything else in the building. The concrete floor was swept. A mop and bucket stood in the corner near the cold storage room, and the bucket was not dry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She heard footsteps on the metal stairs that led up to the office level, steady and unhurried, and then a woman appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at her without apparent surprise. Lorna Peck was 63 years old and had the quality of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors in Maine winters. She was not a tall woman, but she had the particular solidity of someone who has never wasted motion or energy on things that don't require them. She had a gray braid over one shoulder and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she was holding a thermos in one hand and looking at Delia the way you look at someone you expected to arrive. "I thought it would be today or tomorrow," Lorna said. She came down the stairs at the same steady pace. When she reached the bottom, she held out the thermos. "Coffee's fresh. I made it an hour ago." Delia took the thermos. "How long?" she said. "How long have you been keeping it like this?" Lorna considered the question with the care of someone who distinguishes between the simple answer and the complete one. 9 years since Wallace closed the operation, she said. I've been coming in twice a week since about 6 months after that. He asked me to. Delia looked around the main floor again. She thought about 11 years of twice-weekly visits. She thought about the property tax payments she had made each year, automatic and unexamined, and the small monthly arrangement with Lorna that she had continued without ever asking what, specifically, Lorna was doing for it. He said, "You come back," Lorna said. "Not if." "When?" Delia didn't answer that. She unscrewed the thermos cap and poured coffee into it and stood drinking it on the main floor of her father's building while the heaters ran overhead and the cove moved outside the eastern windows. The coffee was good. Wallace had always kept a good coffee setup in the Cannery office, a point of principle he had maintained even after the operation closed, and she understood now that Lorna had maintained it after him. She walked the length of the main floor slowly. Lorna walked with her, but didn't talk, which Delia appreciated. She had always found Lorna easy to be around for exactly this reason. The woman understood the difference between companionship and noise. The processing equipment under the tarps was older than Delia had expected, or rather older than she had remembered. For processing lines, the kind of equipment that had been standard for a small-scale commercial cannery in the 1970s and 80s. Her grandfather had installed the first two lines. Wallace had added the third and fourth in 1981, the year Delia turned 9. She had a memory of watching the installation, enormous machines coming off a flatbed truck in pieces, Wallace directing the process with the focused attention he gave to anything mechanical. The cold storage room at the north end of the building was locked with a padlock she didn't recognize. She looked at it. "That's Wallace's," Lorna said. "I've got a key if you want it. He left it with me, along with instructions that it was yours when you came." Delia looked at the padlock. "Not yet," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Something about the quality of the day, the accumulation of what had already happened since morning, the cardboard box in the backseat of her car, the drive, the lights. She wasn't ready for another thing yet. They went upstairs to the office. It was a single long room across the width of the building, with windows on 3 sides and a view of the cove to the east that was, even in December, even under a white sky, exactly the view it had always been. Wallace's desk was there, his chair, the shelf of binders along the north wall, 30 years of operational records in Wallace's careful handwriting. The coffee set up on the counter by the east window, a proper percolator, and a row of mismatched mugs that she sat in Wallace's chair. She hadn't planned to. It was simply the chair that was there, and she sat in it and looked out at the cove and felt the specific weight of the day settle around her in a way that was not comfortable exactly, but was, she thought, honest. Lorna sat on the old couch along the west wall that had been the office for as long as Delia could remember. "There's a room in the back," she said. Wallace kept it set up. Delia looked at the cove for a moment. She thought about her apartment in Portland with the lease ending in January. She thought about Celia in Seattle. She thought about December and the cardboard box and the drive up Route 1 with the smell of the coast coming through the heating vents. "I'll need it longer than tonight," she said. Lorna nodded, unsurprised. "I figured," she said. She slept better than she had any right to sleep on the first night. The room at the back of the office level was small and wood-paneled and smelled like the rest of the building, coffee and salt, and the particular dryness of a space kept heated through long winters. The bed was a single frame with a wool blanket and a pillow that was softer than it looked. Wallace had put a small lamp on the nightstand and a hook on the back of the door, and nothing else, which was exactly the right amount. She woke at 5:43, which was when she always woke, a habit from 22 years of early commutes that her body had apparently decided to keep regardless of whether there was anywhere to commute to. The cove outside the window was dark. She could hear the water. She lay still for a few minutes listening to it, which was something she had not done since she was a child. She got up and made coffee in the office and stood at the east window and watched the sky lighten over the water. The cloud from the day before had thinned overnight, and the sunrise came in low and sideways. The winter light off the Maine coast that was nothing like the light anywhere else she had lived. She had forgotten this, or she had let herself forget it, which was a different thing. She called Celia at 7, when it would be 4 in the morning in Seattle, which she knew and did anyway, because Celia had always been a light sleeper and because some things didn't wait for time zones. Celia picked up on the second ring. "Mom," she said, the way you say a word when you already know the shape of what's coming. Delia told her about the call from Greg and the meeting with Sutton and the box and the drive. She told it plainly, in the order it had happened, the way she told Celia most things. She heard her daughter go quiet in the particular way she had gone quiet since she was small, absorbing before responding, not reaching for the first available words. "Are you okay?" Celia said. "I'm at the Cannery," Delia said. A pause. "Lorna's there?" "Lorna's here." Another pause. "Okay," Celia said, which meant several things at once, which was efficient, which was a quality Celia had inherited from her father and refined on her own. After the call, Delia went downstairs and walked the main floor again in the morning light. It read differently in daylight, the windows along the east wall, bringing in the low winter sun and laying it across the concrete floor in long strips. She moved slowly, the way she moved when she was thinking through something she didn't fully understand yet. The workbenches were solid. Old growth timber, Wallace's specification, the kind of material you couldn't source anymore without paying considerably for it. The equipment under the tarps was non-functional in its current state. She had no illusions about that, but the bones of it were intact. She lifted one of the tarps on the second processing line and ran her hand along the main housing. The metal was cold and clean. No rust on the components she could see. Lorna had done something to prevent that. Oil or a spray treatment. She wasn't sure which, but something. She found his word journals on the shelf below the operational binders. 6 of them. Composition notebooks with the year written on the spine in Wallace's hand. The last one dated the year before he died. She carried them upstairs and sat at his desk and opened the first one. He had kept them the way that practical men keep records. Not a diary, not reflections, but a running account of what he had done each day and what he had noticed and what he planned to do next. The early journals were dense with operational detail, tide schedules and haul weights and equipment maintenance notes, and the names of the men who worked the lines. She read with the focused attention of someone who is learning a language they had grown up hearing but never formally studied. The 6th journal was different. It started with the same operational entries but shifted about a third of the way through, after the date that corresponded with when Wallace had shut down the commercial operation. The entries became more observational, less procedural. He wrote about the cove. He wrote about the water temperature in different seasons and what he had begun to notice about the shellfish populations along the north face of the bluff. He had been watching something out there, measuring it in the systematic way he measured everything for the better part of 3 years before he died. She read the last dozen entries twice. Then she put the journal down and looked out at the cove for a long moment. Wallace had been tracking something in the water below the cannery. His observations were careful and specific and written in the plain language of a man who had worked that cove for 30 years and understood its rhythms the way you understand the rhythms of something you paid attention to every day for most of your adult life. What he had been observing, documented in the last pages of the last notebook with the same careful handwriting he had used for everything, was a shellfish breeding pattern along the North Bluff that he described as unlike anything he had seen in 30 years on that cove. He had noted the date he first observed it. He had noted the dates of each subsequent observation. He had noted, in the final entry, that he had written a letter to a marine biologist at the University of Maine, whose name he had gotten from a man at the Grover's Neck Harbormaster's office. The letter was folded inside the back cover of the journal. It had never been sent. She sat with it in her hands for a while. Then she looked at the cold storage room at the end of the main floor, visible through the office window, the door with the padlock she had decided the night before she wasn't ready for. She went downstairs and found Lorna and asked for the key. The padlock was stiff in the cold. Delia worked the key the way her father had always worked locks, without forcing it, feeling for the give, and after a moment it turned. The hasp swung free. She pulled the cold storage door open and reached inside for the light switch, a toggle she remembered from childhood in exactly the spot she remembered it being, and the fluorescent tube overhead flickered twice and held. The cold storage room was not cold anymore. The compressor had been disconnected years ago. Lorna had mentioned this the previous evening, and the room was simply a room now, insulated and dry, the metal walls still faintly marked with the frost lines of decades of operation. It was approximately 12 feet by 16. The shelving along the three walls was empty except for a folded canvas drop cloth on the middle shelf and a wooden crate on the floor in the far corner, the kind of slatted pine crate that Wallace had used for equipment storage, not product. The crate had her name on it. Not a label, not a tag. Her name written directly on the wood in Wallace's handwriting, in the black marker he had always used for marking equipment. The same marker whose smell she associated with Sunday afternoons when he did his maintenance work, and she sat on an overturned bucket nearby and talked to him about whatever was on her mind. Delia, for letters, straight and deliberate, the same way he wrote everything. She crossed the room and crouched in front of it. The crate was sealed with 2 wood screws rather than nails, a choice that required a screwdriver rather than a pry bar, a choice that was considered, she understood. She went back to the office and found the toolbox on the shelf by the window, Wallace's toolbox that had occupied that shelf for as long as she could recall, and she took the flathead screwdriver and came back and removed the 2 screws and lifted the lid. Inside was a layer of waxed canvas covering whatever was beneath it. She lifted the canvas. Documents. A manila envelope, thick, sealed with a metal clasp. Underneath it, a smaller envelope with her name written on it in the same black marker. Underneath that, a collection of papers held together with 2 rubber bands, the rubber bands brittle with age, but still holding. She took everything out and carried it upstairs to the desk. She opened the smaller envelope first, the one with her name on it, because it was from him directly, and she wanted that before anything else. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, the same careful script as the journals. He had written it 14 months before he died, which she understood from the date at the top, and she read it slowly, in the way you read something you know you will read again and need to get right the first time. He told her he loved her. He said it plainly at the start, the way he said things he meant, without building toward it. He told her he knew they had not talked enough in the last years, that the distance between them had grown in a way he regretted and had not found the right way to address. That some of that was his doing, and some of it was the way years accumulate when 2 people are each living their own life without enough contact. He told her the cannery had always been intended for her, not as an obligation, not as an expectation, but as something he had spent his working life building for someone to carry forward when he was gone, and she had always been that person in his understanding, even when she was living 9 hours away and making a life that had nothing to do with Maine or canneries or the cove below the bluff. Then he told her about the water. He wrote what he had written in the final journal entries, but in plain language rather than observational notes, the same information organized as explanation rather than record. He had been watching the breeding activity in the North Cove for 3 years. He had read everything he could find. He had spoken to a retired marine biologist named Aldous in Rockport who had driven out to look at the cove on a Tuesday in October and had stood on the dock for 40 minutes without saying much, and then had turned to Wallace and told him that what was establishing itself in that particular stretch of cold water was, as far as he had seen in 40 years of work on the Maine coast, genuinely uncommon. The north face of the bluff, with its specific combination of depth and temperature and substrate, was producing conditions that a particular species of sea scallop, commercially valuable and increasingly difficult to cultivate artificially, was choosing as a breeding site. Not occasionally, consistently. Season after season, the population was growing. Wallace had not told anyone except Aldous. He had not told anyone because approximately 2 years before he wrote this letter, a man had come to Grover's Neck asking questions about the property. Not asking Wallace directly. Asking at the harbormaster's office and the general store and the marine supply, the kind of quiet inquiry that is designed not to look like an inquiry. Wallace had found out through Lorna, who found out through the harbormaster, who found out because small coastal towns in Maine have a way of moving certain kinds of information to the people who need it. The man had come back once more, 6 months later, and this time he had approached Wallace at the dock. Wallace wrote his name at the bottom of the 2nd page, and Delia read it, and set the letter down on the desk and sat very still. The name was Sutton Briggs. She sat with the letter in front of her for a long time. The cove outside the window was doing what it always did, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just been placed in front of her, the water moving in the low December light the same way it moved every other morning. She had the particular stillness of someone whose body has received information that the mind is still catching up to. Sutton Briggs had been to Grover's Neck. Sutton Briggs had stood at her father's dock and asked about this property. Sutton Briggs, who had called her into his office on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks before Christmas and handed her a box and a severance package and the careful language of a man who had rehearsed it twice. She thought about the Allgate account. She thought about the memo she had sent in October, the one that flagged the structural problems, the one that had gone to 2 people above her and 1 below. She thought about the compliance conversations in October. She thought about being the only person in her division whose work touched that file. She had understood in Sutton's office, in the moment between reading the severance terms and signing her name, that the firing was not arbitrary. She had understood it the way you understand things you don't yet have the information to prove. She had the information now. She picked up the manila envelope and opened the metal clasp and took out what was inside. The first document was a letter on company letterhead from a marine resources consulting firm based in Portland. It was addressed to Wallace Hargrove and dated 4 years before his death. It described, in the measured language of a professional assessment, the commercial potential of what Wallace had been observing in the North Cove. The language was careful, but the conclusion was not qualified. The Scala population establishing itself along the north face of the bluff represented, the letter stated, a renewable marine resource of significant commercial value, provided the breeding habitat was protected and a properly structured harvesting arrangement was put in place. The second document was a hand-drawn map of the cove. Wallace's work, precise and detailed, marking the breeding zones along the North Bluff with the methodical accuracy of someone who had been watching and measuring for years. He had noted depths and temperatures and the locations of the substrate formations the scallops were using. The map was dated and signed at the bottom, which was the kind of thing a man did when he understood that a document might need to stand on its own at some point. The third document stopped her. It was a letter from an attorney in Rockland, addressed to Wallace, concerning an inquiry the attorney had received regarding the Hargrove property at Grover's Neck. The inquiry had come through a holding company. The holding company's name meant nothing to Delia at first reading. She read it twice. Then she took out her phone and searched the name. The holding company was a subsidiary of a marine resource acquisition firm. She followed the corporate structure through 2 more searches. The parent company of the acquisition firm appeared in the 3rd search, and she recognized it, not from the name, which she had not seen before, but from the board listing on the company's About page. 2 names into the list, she found what she was looking for. Sutton Briggs was listed as a board member, had been, according to the page, for 11 years. She set her phone face down on the desk and looked at the cove. 11 years. He had been connected to the company trying to acquire this property for 11 years. Wallace had died 4 years ago. Delia had been working for Sutton for 6 years before that, the first 5 of which she had spent in the acquisitions division, where her work had been good enough and her access had been broad enough that she would have been, at any point during those years, in a position to discover what the Allgate account contained if anyone had thought to look at it from the right angle. She had looked at it from the right angle in October. She had put in a memo. She sat at Wallace's desk and thought through the architecture of it with the focused attention she had always brought to complex problems, the same attention that had made her good at her job for 22 years, the same attention that had, she understood now, made her a liability to a specific person once she got close enough to a specific file. Sutton had known about this property for at least 11 years. Wallace had refused to sell. Wallace had died and left the property to Delia. And Delia had been, for 6 years, sitting 9 floors below the man who wanted it, doing work that was useful to him as long as she stayed in her lane and dangerous to him the moment she didn't. She thought about Lorna keeping the heaters running twice a week for 9 years. She thought about the crate with her name on it in black marker. She thought about Wallace standing at the dock while a man from Portland asked questions about the property, and Wallace saying nothing useful, and then coming back to this office and sitting at this desk and writing 2 pages of careful handwriting to a daughter he hadn't spoken to enough in recent years telling her what he knew and what he suspected and where to find what she would need. She opened the fourth document. It was a title search, complete and unencumbered, the Hargrove property at Grover's Neck in Delia's name alone. No liens, no claims, no encumbrances of any kind. Below it was a business card, paper-clipped to the title document. Rowan Aldis, Marine and Property Law, Rockport, Maine. Below the name, in Wallace's handwriting, he's good. He knows the cove. Call him. She picked up her phone and called. Rowan Aldis picked up on the third ring, which was not what she expected on a Wednesday morning in December from a number she had never called before. He had a voice that matched the card somehow, direct and unhurried, the voice of someone who did not spend time on preamble. She told him who she was. There was a brief pause, the kind that contains recognition rather than confusion. Your father talked about you, he said. Not often, but specifically. She told him what she had found in the crate. She told him about the letter and the map and the holding company and the board listing and Sutton Briggs. She told it in order without editorializing, the way she had always organized information that mattered. Rowan Aldis listened without interrupting, which she noted and appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How soon can you come to Rockport?" She looked out at the cove. "Tomorrow morning," she said. He said 8 o'clock and gave her an address, and that was the end of the call. 12 minutes total. She sat back in Wallace's chair and thought that her father had been right about him. She spent the rest of that day going through the binders on the shelf. 30 years of Wallace's operational records, organized by year, each binder tabbed and cross-referenced in the system he had developed early and never deviated from. She was looking for anything that connected to Sutton's approach, any record of contact or correspondence beyond what the crate had already given her. She found two things. The first was a note in the operational binder from 7 years ago, a single page in Wallace's hand, recording a phone call he had received from a man identifying himself as a representative of a marine resource development company. The man had asked about the commercial history of the cove. Wallace had answered the questions about commercial history, which were a matter of public record anyway, and had said nothing about what he had been observing over the previous 4 years. He had written down the man's name and the company name and the date and the time of the call, because Wallace recorded everything, and the company name matched the subsidiary Delia had found in her search the previous morning. The second was a photograph, tucked inside the back cover of the same binder. A printed photograph, the kind you print from a digital file at a drugstore, showing two men standing on the dock below the Cannery. One of them was Wallace, recognizable from the back, his particular posture, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward when he was paying close attention to something. The other man was facing the camera. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, and he was younger than he was now, but the face was the face she had looked at across a desk on Tuesday morning. She set the photograph on the desk beside the letter. Wallace had known exactly who had come to his dock. He had taken a photograph and printed it and filed it, and said nothing to her, nothing to anyone as far as she knew, and had gone back to his desk and continued building the crate with her name on it in the cold storage room. She drove to Rockport the next morning on roads that were clear and dry under a sky that had gone from white to the particular hard blue that came with cold fronts off the water. The office was on a side street 2 blocks from the harbor, a building that had been a ship chandler's at some earlier point in its life and still had the high ceilings and wide floorboards that came from that era of construction. Rowan Aldis was 61 years old and had the quality of someone who had spent his career in rooms where the stakes were concrete rather than abstract. Property disputes, fishing rights, coastal access law, the kind of practice that required knowing the specific weight of specific pieces of ground. He had a long work table instead of a desk, and he had already cleared half of it when she arrived. She laid everything out: the letter, the map, the consulting firm document, the holding company letter from the Rockland attorney, the title search, the photograph, and the printout from her phone searches showing the corporate structure and the board listing. She arranged them in the order they told the story, and then she stood back and let him read. He read carefully and without hurry. He picked up the photograph and looked at it for a moment and set it back down. He read the corporate structure printouts twice. When he finished, he pulled a yellow legal pad toward him and wrote 3 lines, and then looked up at her. "What you have here," he said, "is a coherent record of targeted acquisition activity directed at a property you own conducted without your knowledge, by a person in a position of professional authority over you. He paused. The termination of your employment 2 weeks after you flagged the Allgate account is going to be of significant interest to people who handle wrongful termination cases. That runs parallel to the property issue. Separate proceeding, separate counsel, but the timing is not going to be easy for him to explain. He wrote 2 more lines on the pad. The property, he said, is clean. Your father made sure of that. Title is unencumbered. Your name only, no recorded claims of any kind. There is nothing Briggs or his holding company can do to that title without your consent. She looked at the documents laid out on the table. She thought about 22 years and a cardboard box and a 9-hour drive north on a Tuesday in December. What I want, she said, is to understand what the Cove is actually worth. My own assessment, my own marine biologist, my own numbers. Before anything else. Rowan Aldis looked at her over the legal pad. He wrote 1 more line. I know someone, he said. She's the best on this coast. The marine biologist's name was Dr. Petra Voss, and she came to Grover's Neck on a Friday morning in January with 2 graduate students, a water temperature kit, a dive bag, and the particular focused energy of someone who has been told something interesting and wants to see it for herself. She was 54 years old and had spent most of her career on the Maine and Nova Scotia coasts, and she shook Delia's hand at the dock with the brisk efficiency of someone who would rather be in the water than talking about it. Lorna had coffee ready in the office. Petra took a cup and walked straight to the east window and looked at the cove for a long moment without speaking. Then she asked Delia to show her the map. Delia spread Wallace's hand-drawn map on the work table beside the east window. Petra studied it with the same attention she had given the cove, tracing the marked zones along the north bluff with 1 finger, asking 2 questions about the dates on the depth notations. She looked at the map and then at the cove and then at the map again. Your father had a good eye, she said. This is careful work. They spent 3 hours on the water that morning. Petra and her students worked the north face methodically while Delia stood on the dock and watched the cold coming off the water in a way that was specific to January on this stretch of coast, the kind of cold that had texture to it. She had been in Maine for 3 weeks by then, and her body had readjusted to the climate the way bodies readjust to things they learned early, without resistance, as if it had simply been waiting for the right conditions to remember. Petra came up the dock ladder at 11:30 and pulled her mask off, and stood for a moment looking back at the water. Her expression was the expression of someone working to keep professional composure around something that is making professional composure difficult. She came into the office and dried her hands and accepted a second cup of coffee and sat down across from Delia at the work table. What your father was observing, she said, is a self-sustaining breeding colony of sea scallops on the north substrate. It's been establishing for at least a decade based on the population density. She paused, possibly longer. The substrate conditions on that bluff face are unusual for this stretch of coast. The combination of depth and temperature and the particular rock formation creates a protected microenvironment. She looked at her notes. In 30 years of work on this coast, I have seen 3 sites with comparable conditions. 2 of them are already under conservation and licensing arrangements. The 3rd is federal protected water. Delia looked at her. And this one, she said. This one, Petra said, belongs to you. She came back 2 more times in January, once with a colleague from the university and once alone, and the assessment she delivered to Rowan Aldis's office in the first week of February was 53 pages long and written in the careful language of someone who does not want to overstate and cannot honestly understate. The colony was healthy, self-sustaining, and growing. Properly managed under a conservation-first harvesting arrangement, it represented a renewable resource of substantial commercial value over a long time horizon. She used the phrase generational asset twice and the phrase rare coastal formation 4 times, and she concluded with a licensing structure recommendation that Rowan read and then sat down and looked at the window for a moment before speaking. Your father, he said, knew exactly what he was sitting on. Delia thought about Wallace at the east window with his journal, making notes in the plain handwriting of a man, paying careful attention to something most people would have walked past without looking at twice. He did, she said. The legal proceedings on two separate tracks were moving by February with the steady momentum of things that had been properly assembled and handed to the right people. The wrongful termination case had gone to a firm in Portland that Rowan had recommended, a woman named Claire Maddox who had read the timeline and the Allgate memo and the board listing and the termination date, and had looked up from the documents with the focused expression of someone who has just been handed a coherent argument. The property and fraud matter, the holding company's years of acquisition activity, the corporate structure connecting it to Sutton, was Rowan's territory, and he worked it with the same methodical care as everything else. Delia had not contacted Sutton. She had not responded to the two emails that came to her personal account in January, both carefully worded, both suggesting a conversation. She had forwarded them to Claire Maddox and to Rowan and had not written back. She had extended every professional courtesy to that man for 6 years, and he had used each one. She was finished extending courtesies. She was not building her days around what was happening in those proceedings. She was building her days around the Cannery. She had started with the office, which needed the least structural work, but the most sorting 30 years of Wallace's records organized, cataloged, the operational history of the building understood before anything else. Then she had moved to the main floor, working with a contractor from Grover's Neck named Pete Beaumont, who had done work for Wallace 20 years earlier, and who walked the building with her on a January morning and made a list with the organized practicality of someone who has been assessing old Maine buildings his entire working life. The roof needed 2 sections replaced. The east wall had water infiltration at 2 points that had been managed but not repaired. The loading dock needed new decking. The processing equipment under the tarps was beyond restoration for its original purpose, but the housing was solid and Pete had ideas about what the space could become. Delia listened to him and asked questions and took her own notes and began to understand the building the way you understand something when you give it your full and undivided attention for the first time. He came on a Saturday morning in late February, which was the kind of detail she registered the way she had registered everything since December, with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that details are where the truth lives. She saw the car from the office window, a rental, dark blue, moving down the gravel track at the careful speed of someone who doesn't know the road. She watched it park at the top of the track, where visitors always parked, not where Wallace had always parked, not where she parked, which told her something small and accurate about the distance between his understanding of this place and hers. She set her coffee down. She went downstairs and out the side door and stood on the dock rather than the loading entrance, because the dock was hers in a way the loading entrance wasn't, and she wanted to be somewhere that was hers when he arrived. Sutton Briggs looked diminished. That was the word that came to her, not with satisfaction, simply as an observation. He had always carried a particular quality of ease in professional settings, the fluency of a man who believes the room is arranged around him, and that quality was gone. What remained was someone who had driven 4 hours up the Maine coast on a February Saturday to have a conversation he had been trying to avoid framing as necessary, and who had not yet found the right way to begin it. He walked down to the dock. He looked at the Cannery, at the new decking Pete had finished the previous week, at the repaired east wall, at the cove behind her. She could see him processing what he saw, the maintained building, the working dock, the evidence of someone who had arrived and stayed and was not leaving. "Delia," he said. She waited. He talked for a while, which she had expected. He had always been a man who used volume of words to manage the shape of a conversation, and she had always let him because it had been professionally useful to understand where he was going before he arrived. She let him talk now for the same reason, standing on the dock with her hands in her coat pockets and the cove behind her, listening to the shape of it. He talked about the circumstances and the timing and the difficult position and the decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time. He used the word reasonable twice in 4 sentences, which was the word people used when they were trying to retroactively construct a logic that hadn't been operating at the time. He talked about the Allgate account in the circling language of someone who is acknowledging a thing without naming it. He talked about the property, eventually, with the careful framing of someone who has had several conversations with several attorneys and knows exactly how much he can and cannot say. He wanted her to consider the proceedings. He wanted to discuss a resolution. He used the word resolution the way he had used the word reasonable, as a reframe, as if what had been done was a misunderstanding that two reasonable people could resolve rather than a decade of calculated effort that a paper trail had made visible from every angle. She let him finish. Then she went inside and came back with a folder. "This is everything," she said. She held it out to him. "Everything your attorneys already have and everything mine have prepared. I want you to look at it clearly. The proceedings will continue," she said. "That is not something I am going to change. What you built and what you try to take and what the record shows are three things that belong to you now. I am done managing any of them." She held out her hand for the folder. He gave it back. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "I think you should go," she said, not unkindly, simply as a statement of what was true. He stood on the dock for a moment. He looked at the cove behind her, the north bluff visible in the February light, the water moving in its slow winter way over the substrate that had been building something valuable for a decade while he had been trying to find a way to own it. She did not look away. She did not add anything to what she had said because there was nothing to add. He walked back up to the rental car and sat for a moment before starting the engine and then drove back up the gravel track and turned onto the county road and was gone. The quiet of the property settled back around her. She stood on the dock for a long time. The cove was doing what it always did. The scallops were doing what they had been doing for a decade, building in the cold dark of the north substrate, patient and indifferent to everything above the waterline. Spring was still 6 weeks away, but she could feel it in the angle of the light off the water, the particular shift that happened in late February on this coast when the sun began to return at a different angle and the cold had a different quality to it, less absolute, more provisional. Celia came in March. She drove up from Portland where she had flown in 2 days earlier, and she came down the gravel track in a rental car of her own and parked where Wallace had always parked, under the old spruce at the edge of the property, and got out and stood looking at the building for a long moment before she saw Delia on the dock and raised her hand. They worked together for 2 weeks. Celia had her mother's quality of useful silence, the ability to be present and occupied without requiring the continuous management of her presence. And they moved through the building side by side, painting the office walls, stripping and refinishing the work table, sorting the last of the operational binders into the archival boxes Delia had ordered from the county records office. In the evenings, they cooked in the small kitchen off the back of the office and ate at Wallace's work table looking out at the cove and talked in the way that they had always talked when the usual structures fell away, honestly, without performance. On the last evening before Celia left, they sat on the dock in the March cold with wool blankets and the last of a bottle of wine Celia had brought from Portland, and the cove was doing its evening thing, the water going from steel gray to pewter to the deep blue of a Maine dusk, and the north bluff was visible in the last of the light. "She told me," Celia said, "about the crate and the letter and all of it." She paused. "Not the details, but that he had left something for you, that he'd been preparing it." The licensing agreement was finalized in April. 3 companies had made inquiries after Petra's assessment circulated through the right channels, and Delia had taken her time, reading each proposal with the same attention she had given Sutton's severance paperwork, which was to say completely and without hurry. She selected the one whose conservation terms she respected and whose operational approach matched what Wallace had documented in his journals, a company that understood that the value of what was in the North Cove depended entirely on treating it as a permanent resource rather than an extractable one. The first payment arrived on a Thursday morning in April. She looked at the figure once, and then looked at the cove, and then called Rowan. The wrongful termination case settled the same week on terms that Claire Maddox described as favorable, which in Claire Maddox's language meant considerably more than favorable. The fraud proceedings connected to the holding company's acquisition activity were at a stage that Rowan described with the measured understatement of someone who has been doing this long enough to know what a strong position looks like. Delia read both updates at Wallace's desk and filed them and did not return to them. They were finished and accurate, and she was done attending to them. She bought new equipment for the dock. She hired Pete Beaumont for the second phase of the building work, the conversion of the main floor that he had sketched out on a legal pad in January, a plan that would give a space a use Wallace would have recognized as consistent with what the building had always been, a working place, a place built around the specific knowledge of what the cove could produce. She planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the building in the sheltered space between the wall and the old fuel shed. Raised beds built from the same timber Pete had salvaged from the dock replacement. She had not gardened since a brief and unsuccessful attempt to contain her vegetables in her Portland apartment 7 years ago. This was different. The ground was good. The south wall held the afternoon sun. Things grew. On a morning in May, 5 months after she had turned off the county road and seen the lights on for the first time, she sat at Wallace's desk with her coffee and looked at the cove in the early light. The water was the color it turned in late spring, the deep green blue of the Maine coast when the angle of the sun was right and the visibility was good, and you could see the bottom in the shallows near the point. The north bluff was visible and solid. Below its waterline, in the cold and the dark, the colony was doing what it had been doing for a decade before she arrived and would continue doing long after she was gone, patient and particular and indifferent to everything that was not the slow work of building something in good conditions. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for years, possibly longer, because the kind of work she was doing was not the kind that ended. The building was coming back. The cove was producing. The ground was good. She was 53 years old, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely in the right place for the right reasons, which was not a small thing. It was, she thought, everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.